Welcome back. This is a panel session called the Ebook Unicorn, and it's about standards in ebook development. We have three panelists with us this afternoon. Joshua Tallent is the Chief Ebook Architect at Firebrand Technologies, where he and his team provide ebook design and consulting services to publishers and authors. He's a well-known expert and is a vocal advocate for beautiful, functional, accessible ebook files. I think we can all agree on that. Baldur Bjarnason has made websites and interactive media since the mid-90s and holds a PhD on interactivity in ebooks. He handles e-production for eBOUND, an award-winning online crowd-funded publisher that allows authors to pitch their book ideas directly to readers. And then finally on the end is Jean Kaplansky. Jean is a digital content solutions architect at Aptara. Her publishing production past includes work as an XML architect for Cengage Learning, a systems analyst for Pfizer Global Research and Development, and an XML consultant at ArborText. She is an avid reader and an early adopter of ebooks and ebook-related technologies. So we have just a few questions to frame this conversation today, but we hope that this will bring out things from the audience and we can really have a conversation about really essentially the state of ebook development. Standards is a very broad and meaty issue, but we'll start with something nitty-gritty. So my first question, if I can find it. One of the major challenges in ebook development, as I'm sure some of you know, is something called device fragmentation. The same EPUB will render differently in different apps and e-reading environments. I call it the device fragmentation wormhole. It eats up a great deal of my time personally, and I was hoping to get all of you to speak to that question. It makes ebook development incredibly hard, and I just wonder how you all feel about that. That's the status quo at the moment. It's actually getting worse, if you ask me. And so I'll let you all speak to that question, and let's see where this goes.
You want to go first?
Sure. Well, we just kind of deal with it because we kind of accepted it and absorbed it into the very fiber of our workflow because we know there's going to be a problem. So from the beginning of a process, we're always thinking what's going to work where, how are we going to make this book function the way it's supposed to function and do what the publisher's wanting it to do. And that's obviously a problem if you've got a publisher who says, I want to go everywhere, but they've got a children's book and the children's book is 500 words of text on every page, and you're like, well, it's not really going to be readable on a Nook, really, So, you have to think about what you're going to do to make it work, and what the functionality is going to be, and how it's going to operate. And that's the kind of stuff where, every book is its own project, its own enterprise. And if you're at a publisher that you don't have that flexibility, then you have the problem of saying, to your boss, I'm sorry, we can only make this work here, or we can only do. You gave me 3 hours to do this project and I need 20, Right. That's difficult. So it's a big problem, but it's one of those things that I don't think it's going to go away. I think, like you said, it's getting worse. And we're going to have to find a way of adjusting to it and, adopting whatever models are necessary in-house or workflows are necessary in-house to be able to make that happen.
I mean, it's I'm agreeing with them in terms of it getting worse. And I think the reason for that is that the cause of this fragmentation is not engineering. It's not because it's difficult to make this thing work in the same way across, because they're all, most of these apps and devices are using the same rendering libraries to render the HTML content. There are only, two sort of viable libraries for rendering HTML content that sort of fundamentally undercut, three if you count Adobe's RMS Decay. And the sort of fundamentally the variation between them shouldn't be that great from an engineering standpoint. But there are most of these companies that do these reading platforms. Somebody higher up in the management has made this business decision that everything that is seen on our platform must be different from the way it looks on other platforms, and that business decision is fundamentally incompatible with the goals of our work and of our business, which is that the design of the ebook should be as similar as is possible across all platforms. So there's a fundamental conflict there between the business decisions and business priorities of the platforms and the business priorities of the publishers. And I don't see a way that that can be solved through engineering or through anything except making sure that the money sort of interests aligned between those two entities. But in terms of addressing the problem itself, I mean, one of the things that took a lot of convincing at the publisher where I work is making sure that the CEO and the people in charge understood that the biggest part of ebook development is actually testing. For a lot of titles that we do, because we do a lot of narrative fiction and non-fiction, the actual needs of development are actually fairly low. As in, you know, we can automatically generate the ebooks from a lot of the content we get, but most of the work is in testing, in making sure that the styles are reflected across all, and standardizing that as a workflow is something that has been important, and we're also held there back by the platforms, because my ideal workflow for testing would be I would upload an EPUB to a web service somewhere, and I could send a notification to all of the people who do testing for me, and they'd open up an app and it would automatically download the EPUB from the testing service. It would sync they could highlight all the issues that they find, and it would sync automatically to the central service, and it would all be automatic and sort of just work like magic. But
Sounds great.
You know,
Unicorns.
Yeah, it's unicorns, but it's
That's not a unicorn, actually. There are some XML apps out there at this point, off in the TechCon community, that are getting pretty close in terms of being able to do that kind of review. What they haven't done at this point is add in the EPUB capability.
Yeah.
But there are definitely vendors out there who are working on that online sync it up review type of goal.
Especially if you look into web development, the tools that you get in the web development community are amazing compared to what you get in ebook development. So many tools and inspections and reports and issue tracking, and it's I want all of that for ebook development. Sort of to just all of it, all of the above, copy paste into ours and make it work.
So I'm going to agree with both Baldur and Josh.
It's the only question you get an agreement from us on.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm going to offer a little bit of a different thing here, because I'm coming at this from the world of HTML and XML first, rather than jumping in at the point of ebooks and then going, because back in the day when we were doing typography and there were no GUIs, it was a matter of a calculator, a pica stick, and measuring, and then printing, and then looking at the galley that came off the ancient HP printer and going, does this match up, and measuring some more. And so your source of did it work was what you printed, what came off the printer. Well, the thing is that was what came off that printer, not necessarily what came off the linotype, not necessarily what came off the printer in the other room. So what do we know here? We've set expectations, and this has been happening in web development for a really long time. We've gone through these exercises of saying, okay, it's going to be pixel perfect, and it's going to look the same in this browser, that browser, and the other, and we've done some extensive gymnastics to try to do that. And we kind of, we dug ourselves down the wrong hole. And it's not serving us well now. The expectation that everything must be pixel perfect, and because it's a standard, that means it will be pixel perfect across the board, is actually not really a reasonable expectation. The fact of the matter is that if you look at any of the browsers right now, the ones that are doing HTML, it still looks different. And it's going to look different from Safari to IE to Firefox to Chrome. And it's always going to be that way. And the same thing is true of ebook platforms and ebook apps. It's not reasonable to expect that it's always going to render the same way. This is a new world. And in this world, to go back to content strategy, we don't have control over what screen, device, size, context, anything that the user can do with the content that is in front of them. They have the control. So it's no longer up to the publisher, especially since most of the vendors have turned publisher formatting defaults to off.
Right.
So it's something that needs to be considered, that just because you have a standard, standards are great. You know, we have light bulbs, we have keys, we have the web. But expecting pixel perfect same presentation across the board is probably not going to ever be a reasonable expectation.
Well, and I think that also comes back down to the question of standards themselves. I mean, EPUB doesn't specify that reading systems have to display the content exactly the same way.
Actually,
Exactly.
EPUB actually doesn't specify rendering in any way.
Exactly, and that's the point.
Literally, they do not. They have no opinion whatsoever on how it looks like,
Right.
and there's no way to hold anybody accountable for completely destroying the rendering of your book, because they could.
Except just in that,
it's not specified in any way.
Well, it specifies that it's supposed to support CSS,
Yeah,
and
but-
what parts of CSS it's supposed to support.
But they also specify that it's supposed to display in a way that is completely undescribed in any web by any web standards, which is interactive paginated view, and that has not been described by anybody how that's supposed to work.
And
And
that-
there are so huge bits of the CSS spec and JavaScript spec that need to be where the paginated rendering needs to be accounted for, which at the moment are where the assumption of scrolling view is built in. And there's no IDPF has completely ignored the work of doing that, because they say it's supposed to be World Wide Web Consortium, and the World Wide Web Consortium say, well, we don't really know ebooks, so somebody else has to do it. And in the end, I think it's Adobe who have sacrificed a couple of their engineers on the altar of compatibility and told them to go work there with those standards people and see if you can figure something out. And last time I met one, he was sort of sounded like he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown.
So I can bring a little perspective to this one, again, because I was a style sheet developer in the 90s, from 95 to 2000, and I worked for a company that worked with military spec, PRF 28001, C, U.S. military spec. But this was a U.S. military spec for writing style sheets that was supposed to be applied for SGML, and it was supposed to be the big thing. And believe me, we've been through quite a few style sheet languages that are supposed to be the big thing. CSS is just the most recent. But in this particular case, we have one vendor that really threw all in with this spec, and we had the engineers, and it was something that we worked very hard on, and we had all sorts of little, programming hooks into it. And the committee was basically on hiatus. They weren't changing anything. There was only one other vendor who was actually supporting it. So when the software company I worked for needed to make changes to support our customers' business requirements, we made extensions. Why? Because it was the bottom line for our customers and the bottom line for having them buy our product. But at the same time, the competing product that also supported the same spec, you could throw the same style sheet at both of those engines and come out with different results. And that is fundamentally down to the engineering of how the spec is interpreted.
Yeah.
And that's what these specs really are. They're specifications. They're not standards. A light bulb is a standard. An electrical outlet, whether you're in the Europe or India or over here in North America, is also a standard. Anything that is put out by the W3C, the IDPF, or any of the other quote-unquote standards groups are not actually standards. All they are is specifications. They're open to interpretation.
Well, I think we get back down to the question of what's the intent of those specifications. Is the intent to give designers the ability to say that they know they're going to be pixel perfect design applied across every platform? Not really. Honestly, I think that the intent of the specification, the reason why the design aspect is not really dealt with as much, is because the specification is there to guarantee that reading systems can open the file can know the structure of the file, and like Matt Garish did a really good job of explaining, can handle the file in an accessible way. That's the goal of the specification. We can deal with the questions of design all day long, but every single book is different in design. And so there's going to be different needs for different books by different designers, published by different publishers across the entire world, depending on a variety of issues. I don't know the specification really needs to handle. The specification needs to be able to say, if you open a document and it's got Japanese, display the Japanese. And if it's supposed to go right to left and top to bottom, then display it right to left and top to bottom. But whether it's bolded with a bold that's this way or that, or it's got the ability to some sort of default specification on margins or something, those are things that should be done in the style sheet, and hopefully will be assigned, because we're using the same display engines across most of these platforms, will be at least understood in a consistent way. They may not be exact, but then again, that's the point you were making. It's not going to ever be exact necessarily. That's not the point of the specification, though, in my opinion.
A couple of points there is that, I mean, I'd be happy if just all of the ebook platforms stopped breaking valid books. I'd be happy if I could say this is a valid book and I can rely on this being readable and not break across the board. Like images that are rendered wrong. Completely, either sort of just completely bananas sizes, or broken across pages, or just basic stuff like that. Sort of, and it sort of even the sort of current darling of sort of ebook rendering, which is iBooks, has completely schizophrenic image handling.
Yep.
I'd just be happy. Screw sort of the whole pixel perfect rendering. I'd just be happy if they stop breaking things.
I would question whether iBooks is actually the current darling of ebooks.
Yeah.
But again, I mean, Josh pretty much confirmed and extended upon what I was saying, is that a specification is something that's up for interpretation. And vendors, at the end of the day, especially software vendors, are in the business of making money. And when they are in the business of making money, that means they compete against each other. So there is a good reason for them to make things look differently.
Yeah.
And there's no rule or fundamental law that says that everything needs to look the same. Approximation, similarity is a good thing. You have UIs, you have Chrome, you have user experience that you've got, I mean UI Chrome I'm talking about, not the browser, but you have different features for these readers that all go into the experience that you have with that one reader at that one point, wherever you might be, on the train, on a plane, in a box with a fox. So the fact of the matter is that, again, it comes down to expectations about what can and cannot be done. Now, some of you may be aware that I did a case study with a customer over the last year where we did one EPUB 3 file for 22 apps and devices. Well, officially 22 apps and devices. We threw it against the wall to see what stuck at a bunch of other places as well. And what we wound up doing, other than tearing our hair out as we looked at the different specifications and had this one say, don't specify margins, and that one say, yes, specify margins, was we wound up trying to get as much into the CSS and the semantic HTML and all those HTML elements that Matt was referring to and that Liza referred to earlier. We used those. And we didn't do stupid things with class names either. And we made it hang together in such a way that we could use that CSS such that it wouldn't break nooks because the media queries were somewhere in the middle, such that we went and looked at the, especially for list formatting, we had to fiddle with the indents here and there in a lot of different places until we got something that worked across the board. And it was a lot of work. We did a lot of testing. We also learned, and I already knew this, don't rely on emulators, don't rely on previewers. They're not, if you want to see what it's going to look like on the device, look at it on the device. And, you can get devices cheap these days. You can get them off eBay. You can borrow them from a friend. I mean, they're easy to come by.
I guess this gets to my next piece then, which
Yeah.
is that it feels like ebook development is held hostage a little bit by the vendors. And I can hear you saying that this is a business decision and maybe our expectations of the ebooks we create are too high. But this feels very frustrating in a really nitty-gritty day-to-day way for someone who creates ebooks. We have to deal with whatever they kind of permit us in a way.
Oh, yeah.
And this feels really frustrating.
That's what our project was. I mean, part of the reason why people were interested in our project was because it was for an educational publisher, but we didn't go with internal educational platforms. We didn't have our own internal reading system. We didn't pay a bunch of money to somebody for,
Right.
a platform. We were stuck within the constraints of what retail apps and devices allowed.
And
And-
unfortunately, that's the way things are, right? Right.
Oh, yeah.
There's very little. We are kind of held hostage in a sense. I think that there's two ways to look at this, though. There's the we're being held hostage way, and there's also the more positive way of saying, let me take advantage of some of these things. Now, granted, that takes more time, it takes more effort, more money, which in a lot of cases, especially when you're developing for a publisher, you don't have time or money to do those kinds of things. But there are good examples, and some of the examples that were brought up today about using iBooks Author. That idea of saying, well, we got an art book, and Tina did a really good job of expressing how do you handle these kinds of very specialized books. We're going to take advantage of the features that are available by that hostage holding,
Right.
reading system. So, is that a preferable approach? Maybe not, especially if you're trying to get a book out everywhere and you just want to I want a good nonfiction title that's going to work on every device. I don't want to have to go crazy trying to figure out whether margin is going to work here or there. But again, I think there's two ways to look at it. There's the way of saying, this is so horrible, and just beating ourselves up over it. And there's a way of saying, well, let's just take advantage of the differences and try to find where the good differences are to tweak this here on this device and sell it. Use it as part of the marketing. If you've got an iBooks file, an EPUB file you're selling in iBooks that has video, then make a big deal about it or whatever, right? Whatever it is you're taking advantage of that's different about that reading system could be seen in a positive light.
And I don't think it's a matter of
you're more patient
hostage.
than I am.
I don't think it's a matter of hostage, and I don't think it's a matter of this mythical idea of, this EPUB stuff, nobody ever really uses it. I don't think that's true either, because the fact of the matter is that at this point, the origin for the files that go out on any vendor, including the Long River in South America, which shall not be mentioned. The origin of all those files at this point, preferred, is EPUB. What happens to that EPUB once it's ingested into the reading systems, that is internals, and that is going to be different across the board. You would like to think that because they're using either RMSDK or they're using WebKit or another rendering engine, that you would at least get some similarity. But at the end of the day, it's how the engineering was done to make that EPUB come apart and then go back together in the reading environment. And that's not something we're ever going to have any control over. So, are we being held hostage, or is this just the reality that we have to live with?
It can be both.
I don't, see, the thing is, I'm more practical than that. I don't think of it as being held hostage because I work within the parameters of the technology I have to work with, and that's just how it's always been.
Yeah, but we are in a situation now that there are a lot of titles where that simply it's not cost effective to turn them into ebooks because none of the platforms can do the content justice.
Right.
And if we tried to turn them into ebooks, we would just lose an absolute mess of money on it. And that, in a way, that is a weakness in the platforms, that they can't address that market. That we have to turn to other platforms.
Is it a weakness or is it an evolution? Is it a weakness or is it just it hasn't evolved?
Well, the thing is, the fact that you can almost always do the same titles in as a website and keep sort of 99% of the design features that you need, but you can't in ebooks, which are ostensibly supposed to be based on the same technology. There's a regression there that does not resemble evolution.
Yes and no. Ideally, at this point, IDPF is trying to closely align themselves with the W3, and they've started a digital publishing interest group. At least 2 members here, or 1 member and 1 former member. And with the digital publishing interest group, the idea is to bring these things more in line with one another, because when we get to the future of EPUB, whatever that may be, and probably without a number, it is very, very likely that the next, really big version is going to say, okay, browsers, not apps, but browsers.
Well, I would also point out that we don't expect that every codex that was ever published on Vellum will look just as great published by print on demand, right? There's still a difference here, and there's still I think that one of the points was again made by Tina earlier today. Art books are still valuable as books, right? There's a question of medium and a question of whether we should be focusing so much energy on the things that we can't do in EPUB or the things we can't do in reading systems, and be thinking more about the things we can, and dealing with the question of what should we be doing in this new medium. And if there's some things that don't work in ebooks, then let's not do them in ebooks. Let's find other ways of getting that content, that information, that stuff out to the public where people can get access to it. It doesn't, just because we have an ebook system doesn't mean we have to publish everything in ebooks.
The problem there is that, even though I agree with that's the way it should be, and that's the attitude that publishers should take, I haven't encountered a publisher yet that thinks that way. They always think
but
that.
That's why we're here.
Almost everyone I've encountered thinks that there should be a one-to-one match between print titles and an ebook version.
Right.
That there is no other alternative for turning something into a digital product than a direct translation into ebooks. And I've tried to convince quite a few of them that you should look into, retool this and just rethink this. This would do better as a website, or this would do better as an app, and you should do it that way. But it's a non-starter. Publishers just, they'd rather lose the digital revenue entirely than try to go that avenue of trying to retool
I don't
the
think
content.
that's not necessarily true where a lot of education publishers are at right now.
I'm talking.
Trade
When I say
publisher versus
publishing, I mean
education.
trade publishing.
When you mean trade publishing, I mean,
no
I can
offense
get that.
to all of the other great publishing markets that are out there that are doing amazing things.
Because there are, I'm seeing this I'm seeing this in 2 different places, and I'm seeing it in comics and manga, and I'm seeing it over in education publishers. And the fact of the matter is that I've got customers coming to me right now going, we have a mandate from our government, we must do EPUB 3, and this is how we have done things. We have all this ancillary content, it's in Flash, it's locked up on websites. We want this to be in EPUB 3 where we have the interactive assets integrated in some sort of way. So they are starting to open up more and more to the idea of retooling. Now, if you're talking about your simple trade, reflowable text, and not necessarily things that are fixed layout, it's a different animal altogether. And I question, really, it's reflowable text. Publisher doesn't have control over anything. Everything is under control of the user, depending on the platform they're on. And look at Marvin. You can control everything down to the kerning.
Right.
So
let's push on to the last piece, being
Okay.
mindful of the time and wanting to allow audience participation. If you had one sort of fairy tale wish for the state of ebook development, what would it be?
Well, things that didn't break.
Yeah.
It's sort of. I have low expectations. I'm easily pleased. I just don't want things that don't break all the time. Sort of. I'm not. They don't even have to be sort of. They can break sometimes. Like if you're doing web development, things are buggy there and break all the time. But they're more easily fixable and easily sortable than the development processes around ebooks and ebook. Platforms seem to proliferate in bugs and also, you've seen special characters being dropped, all sorts of crazy things that just why is this basic feature not working? So
Yeah.
that'd be my basic unicorn wish for the future is just, stop breaking things.
I think my one big one would be being able to control having an image and a caption on the same page.
You're really thinking big.
Yeah, this is a big deal. I deal with this every day.
Yeah.
But having the ability, basically the ability to control the vertical content size, right, on a page, and be able to say, if you can't fit the whole thing, scale that image. I'm okay with that.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
don't just
yeah.
scale it horizontally. Let's scale it
Yeah.
vertically. That little thing would actually make a huge difference, I think, in the display of most of the content that we work on.
Right.
And then you're starting to get into algorithmic stuff that's just not part of EPUB readers at this point. But if you had to move on to my, and I'm not going to call it a unicorn because I don't want to think of it as a mythical thing. I want to think of it as a direction that we're headed in. MathML and accessibility.
Yeah.
Right now, we have some very limited capability of MathML, and it's a real problem. I mean, math is like a universal thing. It looks differently from east to west sometimes, but it is still, the thing that makes up science, the thing that makes up technology, and it's a really important thing to publishing. So why is it treated as this, poor orphan redheaded stepchild? I don't get that, and it's something that I've been advocating for a while. We're starting to make progress.
You can, one thing about MathML is that you can't lay the blame there entirely on the sort of platform vendors because the underlying libraries, there's been a serious lack of attention being paid to MathML in the sort of underlying web browser engines.
Yeah.
I mean, didn't they turn off the MathML
They
support
did.
for Chrome for a
Okay,
while?
so if we have to go there, the MathML support got ripped out of Chrome. MathML support is still in Firefox. It's limited in Safari. There is an initiative. We do have somebody who's a former MathJax developer who did a sort of Kickstarter campaign to actually go and fix some of the things in Gecko and in WebKit. And his position is that if I fix it all in WebKit, it should be easily ported over to Chrome. Problem is that right now, Google and Chrome, they have specified they're not really interested in features. Right now, they're interested in performance.
Yeah.
We know this because they've decided to reject the idea of supporting CSS regions.
Yeah.
And with the other developers, if you've read Peter Krautsberger's article on O'Reilly about MathML, he's the product manager of MathJax, most of the people who are doing the development are volunteers. And so there's really nobody at the basic, rendering companies, Mozilla and Google and et cetera, who actually own and are taking responsibility for accountability for the math features or other features that go into these rendering engines. And until somebody actually does take responsibility and accountability at the vendor level for these things, we're going to be stuck in this situation of volunteers and Kickstarters and substitute JavaScript libraries.
My fairy tale wish is that people use InDesign effectively.
Okay, I have another fairy tale wish. People stop using InDesign.
Yeah.
Seriously.
I second that.
Yeah.
There are style sheets that can be automated to do so much more than what InDesign can do, which is somebody hammering on it all day long.
And usually hammering in the wrong way.
So at this point, I would love to invite audience questions and participation. This is the commiseration part of the day, maybe. So we have 10 minutes left, and let's make full use of it.
Be rageful, nerds.
Exactly.
So I get to play bad cop where I work, and I would like your support. Our ebook workflow, we outsource our InDesign files, and then they come back as ebooks, and the first stop is to go to the designers and editors for QA, and then it comes to our ebook developers for to fix their concerns and to do a spec check. And it goes to the authors and editors first because it's a good training tool to start to get them thinking this way. We have to force them to do this. And there's two camps. Sometimes the authors and editors will say, well, why doesn't my book look like this across all the e-readers? And I'll give them an answer, and it's like a battle they don't want to fight. So they're like, okay, what do I tell the authors and editors that say, I need this to look this way, especially for like highly designed titles where they can't let the control go, and it needs to be just like one sentence so I can email it to them and they'll read it.
The answer that we always give them is, I'm sorry, I can't do that. No, but there really isn't a one-sentence answer to that. In a lot of cases, it's, that's the limitations of the system, and there's nothing. I dealt with a client last week who had this very issue. He went through 15 rounds of revisions on his book. And we started charging him after the second round because everything he was asking for was stuff that it's not fixable. It's things like he wants to edit this sentence so that the text will come up and, not have a run on, a widow on the other page. And then I told him, what version of iBooks are you running and what version of iOS? And he said, iOS 5. Okay, well, update to iOS 7. Tell me how it looks then. And he came back to me after we've gone through 15 rounds of revisions. He came back to me and said, now I understand what you've been saying. So, because everything that he was seeing on his, we weren't seeing on ours, and we were having to go back and forth on, that's just not possible. You're not understanding what's going on. So, honestly, I don't know that there's a single answer. I think the only way that we've found to educate our clients on those issues is to sit down with them and say, let me walk you through the book for 5 minutes and have you change the font size and have you turn the page and have you put it on a different device and show you that this is not stuff that we're controlling. This is stuff the user is controlling, and that's why you're seeing a lot of the differences that you're seeing. It's just not possible to make it look exactly the same way as your print book.
I think that should be actually an introductory guided consulting education effort before you even start touching an author's content. You really need to sit down with them. You need to set expectations. And if they have expectations that they are reluctant to let go of, then you need to explain to them that they no longer have that control in a digital content world. The control is in the hands of the user.
Yeah. That's another point too, and it's something I would highly advocate for every publisher in the room. Get your digital publishing specialist involved in the acquisitions meetings before you're even dealing with the design of the book.
That's just crazy talk.
Yeah, it is crazy talk. I know
Crazy
publishers.
talk.
I know publishers that do it, and they have the best results because
I bet.
at the very beginning of the process, the author is made aware of the fact that their digital product will look different, and they can deal with the assets issue from the beginning and say, "Oh, you want to have a 360-degree thing? Well, okay, we need to deal with that before we get to the ebook stage, and we're last minute trying to publish the thing." So get involved, and if you're the digital production person or you're in charge of digital production, go to your boss and say, I have to be in every acquisitions meeting. You have no choice. If you want to get good books out of me, I have to be able to be there. It's imperative that you get that digital development not be the redheaded stepchild, not be the last thing on the list that's dealt with for 5 minutes at the very end.
Mm-hmm.
What they said.
Thank you. Thanks, Colleen. Anybody else?
The representative from Kobo.
Hello, Ben.
I guess I've already been introduced. So we've seen some interesting presentations today, and seen things that can be done with art books, seen responsive comics, a lot of new features, and talking about which platforms support what. And then we're also, especially in this panel, talking a lot about things that are broken. And this is an industry that's moving very quickly and seems to be doing two things at once, which is like, look at this cool new thing, and oh man, that other thing's really broken. Mm-hmm. So kind of back to like Laura's question about what would be your wish, if you could kind of control the way this industry is steered in the coming years, do you think it needs to pause and fix things that are broken before it can move ahead? Or do you think these two things, in stuff that's broken being fixed and new cool things being introduced, can go on evolving without our having to pause and say, well, let's stop pushing the boundaries on new features before we figure out how to prevent images from breaking over pages and stuff like that?
I don't think there's a choice. I think that the industry is just going to keep moving, and as long as they think they can make money by adding new features, they'll continue to add new features, and until somebody really prioritizes broken features, as in it's going to cost a vendor a lot of money, things that are broke may stay broke. Now, that's not the goal, and there are definitely QA teams that are working on it. But it comes down to business requirements, management priorities. That stuff trickles down.
Mm-hmm.
And until management decides that fixing stuff is a priority over new stuff, it's not something that we have control over.
Well, if I were to recommend to a reading system manufacturer which side of that equation, I'd say both, but do it in chunks. You know, it's very easy in software development. You know, anybody who's dealt with software development knows that it's easy to get caught up in the issues that come up, and you have to deal with this fire and put this fire out and whatever. But if you were to set aside a couple of sprints to deal with some of the core issues that ebook developers are dealing with every day, and fix a couple of those key bugs that just make life hard for people who are building ebooks, those sprints would make a huge difference in the lives of lots of people who have frustration, and would make a big difference in how books render, while at the same time not ignoring the sprints that you're focusing on new development, new features, new ideas, and those kinds of things. But I think that there's a benefit in saying let's put some dedicated effort to both of these things, and not get too caught up in the fires that have to get, and the priorities that can get pulled this way and that way.
One of my my favorite thinkers in web development is Douglas Crockford, who is a JavaScript genius. And if you have even the slightest interest in JavaScript, you owe it to yourself to buy all of his books and also watch all of his lectures on YouTube. One of the points he made is he claims that one of the best things that happened to web development was Internet Explorer's dominance and stagnation. Because for several years, everything stopped while the Internet Explorer dominated, and they just worked on the bugs in the specifications. They worked on settling things down, and what happened in web development is basically what you're talking about. They stopped coming up with all of these new crazy things, and things like Ajax and the XML HTTP request feature. Was something that it was an old technology, but it just took years for it to become viable in the way it was implemented. So I'd have to say I disagree. I think yes, stop doing the new things and fix things that are working now, because that's how we got to a usable state on the web. That's if we'd kept the same pace of coming up with new things in web development, things would be a disaster. It would be completely unusable. We wouldn't be able to make anything. So I think there's definitely a need to pause, stop making new things, and or if you're going to do new things, just do them on the web and in apps, and stop worrying about trying to address that market within ebooks. But on the ebook side, just focus on fixing the stuff that we've got and making sure we do it as best as we can. Because I think that in the long term, that's the way the entire industry is going to deliver the most value. And I think that's the way that the industry is going to make the most money in the long run.
Good point.
Also, read Crockford's stuff. He's awesome. He's best JavaScript genius on the planet.
Well, that's us. That's time. Many thanks to my fellow panelists. This was a really great conversation. Thank you.